So Barbara's speech has inspired me to also divert a little bit. I want to talk about what I think is the elephant in the room, one of the elephants in the room. There is the very bad element that you all have talked about, and they're making a wreck out of this country. And it's a hard word to use, but you're looking at fascism, plain and simple. And people got to get comfortable with that word, because that's what this is. And it's racist. When the President of the United States says, if you see a woman or a person of color in a position of importance, they're there because of DEI. As if only white males have merit, and everybody else is there because somebody's doing them a favor or trying to be politically correct. That way of looking at people is dehumanizing. And we just got the President's executive order telling me all the reasons I can get arrested. This is priceless, and it's really irritating. We operate homeless shelters. If an undocumented person is in one of our homeless shelters, I, the county executive who has funded this, is harboring a criminal and can be arrested for that. And I'm thinking to myself, these people wrapping themselves in a flag and a Bible, calling themselves Christians, and saying that if you're hungry, we're not going to feed you. If you're sick, we're not going to take care of you. And if you're unsheltered, we're not going to shelter you. I don't get the connection between Christianity and that set of values, and I don't think most people who are Christians do either. And I dearly wish more people would call them out for that, because it is an abuse. I'm not an overly religious person, but it is an abuse of religion and belief systems to call something what it is not. And people need to speak up about that. The other thing I want to say off topic is that a lot of what the federal government's doing is absolutely horrible. But I'll say local governments have choices. And I'm guilty of proposing a 0.1% increase in property taxes. Not property taxes, income tax. You have a federal government which, as Congresswoman Bonnie said, is shifting the burden to local governments. They're not going to be in the housing field. They're cutting money for food. They're cutting money for things that we think are important. We can either try to absorb those cuts by cutting services, which is the choice I was faced with this year. We're not going to cut the schools. We know we're not going to cut fire and police. So what you're left with is either social services, the things that improve people's lives, or environmental actions we're trying to take, or you can deal with a small tax increase. And knowing that upper middle class and wealthy people are going to get enormous tax breaks, we should not be shy about trying to reclaim some of that money that used to flow to us from the government because of the funds they got from taxpayers. We should not be shy about trying to reclaim some of that in local government, because if we walk away from it because they've walked away from it, we're going to be in a world of hurt that even magnifies what the federal government's doing to us. And I think people need to think about this. We cannot do less and expect things to get better. And we can't bemoan them doing less and then ourselves take steps to do less and wind up in a situation which I think is untenable. So I'm not shy. You all know how I feel about this stuff. I wear my heart on my sleeve, and I'm a big believer that we need to take the steps that are necessary. And I'm trying to get my silly computer to behave. You need to swipe up, yes. So back to housing. First of all, good morning, sort of. And thank you, Barbara, for your continued leadership on housing, and I really appreciate the passion that you brought to your introduction today. I want to be clear that no matter what's happening in Washington, we're not retreating. We've reassured the minority communities and the immigrant communities. We're not going backwards, and we will not accommodate or become accomplices for what essentially are crimes against humanity. That's not us. Housing policy, though, and I want to be clear about this, is not about how do we increase stock prices for shareholders or developers' profit margins. It's about people, families, and futures. The more we treat rates of return as sacred cows, the less affordable housing we get. And that's just the reality. I get solicitations saying, if you invest in this project, you'll get a 20% rate of return. It's a housing project. If people are getting a 20% rate of return on investments in housing, you can bet it's impossible for affordable housing developers to build anything affordable with those kind of rates. I care deeply about this. I was a teacher at Rolling Terrace. I saw firsthand what housing instability looks like. Kids bounce from school to school because their families couldn't afford the rent. Families doubling up or living in places that were unsafe. I knew the difference because I lived in Tacoma Park, and Tacoma Park had rent stabilization. And families stayed in neighborhoods because they didn't face unpredictable rent increases at the end of every year. And the difference is when family stays in neighborhoods, they become stabilized. They take an interest in the community. They know they're going to be longer, so they don't feel like, why should I invest in this community? Because tomorrow I'm going to be gone. Next year I'm going to be out of here. When people believe they're going to be able to stay there, they start acting like the community belongs to them. And I think that's one of the most important things that rent stabilization has been able to do, because if the market itself can't control itself, you need something to offset the tendency to displace people and cause heartbreak. So the county, we've put in a record amount of affordable housing money, $168 million to preserve existing units and build new ones. We're working on projects like Hillendale Gateway and the Chimes in North Bethesda. The newly opened Allium Place off of Veers Mill Road is 100% affordable and actually has some ownership units in this. And it's the first project I worked on, and it's frustrating because I'm 5 years into this, 6 years into this. It should not take 6 years to get a project into the ground and out of the ground. And that's something we've got. Now, there were the COVID years, which threw everything off, and COVID years which sent prices up, which made balance sheets not work so well, and people have to go back and recalibrate. But too much of it takes too long. We're working with HSE and Amazon's housing investment to thwart the planning boards and the then council's plan to displace existing affordable housing in Bethesda with luxury housing. This is on Battery and Bradley Lane, where they actually tripled the density for new development and produced fewer affordable units than exist today with 1/3 or less of the density. You cannot sustain affordable housing if your housing policies actually reward high-end housing and lead to losses of existing affordable housing. So I was very vocal about what I thought about when I was on the council, and it still bothers me, and I'm glad HSE stepped up to help us, because if you hadn't helped us preserve those units, those people would have been toast. And oddly enough, they would fit the perfect definition of what people call workforce housing, and that housing would have been gone. If you make $60,000 or less in this county, good luck finding a place to live. It's almost impossible. If you're a family making $60,000 or less in the county, it is an amazing struggle. And if you make $75,000, you're in this weird worse spot because you don't qualify for assistance programs that we have, and you make too little money to get into market rate housing. Our MPDU program was created 50 years ago. Back then, MPDUs were advertised as for firefighters, police officers, and teachers. Those were the low-income people in Montgomery County. It ain't like that anymore. Demographics have changed. We did a lot of zoning that brought in a lot of mixed use. Mixed use brought in a lot of retail and services. Retail and services do not pay living wages to people. And if we hadn't had the minimum wage, which, by the way, Ralph, if it's any comfort, we're up to $18 in Montgomery County for the larger companies and over $15 for the smaller companies. If we hadn't done that, people would be struggling even more than they are today. So we have an enormous workforce now that can't even afford an MPDU. So we've gone from a plan to where we identified who needed it, and we're in a world now where the people who need it don't qualify for it. And even some teachers don't qualify. So we've got issues that we need to deal with. And I will say the planners who are fixated on people rather than density have been much more successful in recognizing that the purpose of what you're planning for is for the human beings. And density, which is kind of like a mantra that people throw around. We need more density, density, density. Density gets you units that cost 600 or more square foot to build. None of them are affordable. And as a government, if I try to subsidize a 600 square foot unit to build, the cost to build, it is extraordinarily difficult to do that, and I can subsidize far fewer units. Lower buildings in the 7, 8, 9-story range offer the opportunities to build the housing we need at a wider range of affordability and makes our government dollars go further. And we are currently stalled in Montgomery County. We have over 34,000 units in a pipeline that have already been approved. So tell me how you have a housing crisis when you've got 34,000 approved units that where all the developer has to do is build a building permit. And part of the reason is much of it is high-rise housing. There is not a demand for high-rise housing. High-rise housing has locked up a ton of land in Montgomery County, made it unable to develop that land because you can't get the return on a high-rise. And if you paid high-rise prices for the land, you don't want to build anything less because the land cost was built into your model of what you can afford to build for a building. So land that's zoned high-rise costs more than land that's zoned for lesser units. So we need to rethink some of the stuff we're doing. The high-rises have led to pretty much only building single one bedrooms, some studios, and a rare 2-bedroom. You almost never get a family-sized unit in the high-rises. And when the family-sized units come, they cost upwards. And the project on the Strathmore Metro, a 3-bedroom unit's about $11,000. Not very affordable. And we're not building a community because if you're a single person, you can live in Bethesda, but as soon as you want to raise a family, because there aren't any 3 or 4-bedroom apartments there, you have to leave Bethesda. I knew people in New York City where families grew up in apartment buildings, so they lived in 3- and 4-bedroom apartment buildings. And it's possible to do that, but that's not the housing type that people prefer to build. So we're not building affordability. We need more family-sized units. We need more ownership opportunities. And I've been talking about this since I got elected, and I still struggle a little bit with our nonprofit partners because ownership is not something that's on the tip of everybody's tongue, but everybody knows that the Black community and minority community will never build wealth here if they don't get an opportunity to own property and own their housing. So we all know what the consequence of only building rental housing is. We have struggled to wrap our heads around how do we change our model from rental housing to more ownership opportunities. And as long as I'm active in things, I'm going to continue to try to push that. I am happy that the planning board actually turned around the housing project in 3 months. And it was a big deal to get this project done. I am hoping that that becomes the norm, because you shouldn't spend years in the planning department trying to get projects done. And if this is the way we can do things, I think that's one thing at least will address some of the developers' angst, because time is money. And when people are sitting on property for 5 years, they're paying 5 years of interest, 5 years of property taxes, and their project, when it gets built, has 5 years of inflation added to it. Hard to keep things affordable when we do that. And we need to plan, when we're doing these centers, which are we're trying to concentrate development, we need to plan for a complete community there. We've got to be committed that everybody who works there should be able to have the opportunity to live there. And again, people who support mixed-use housing and understand and want mixed-use development understand you actually need more lower-cost housing and mixed-use developments than you do elsewhere, because you're putting a lot of retail and services there. You're putting a lot of people who don't have money to buy market-rate housing. And so we actually consciously need to increase the amount of money or the amount of opportunities that go forward for people with lower incomes. And I'll say something else about folks with lower incomes. The difference between lower income and middle-class incomes in terms of housing, if you're lower class, and you're struggling to find a unit in Montgomery County, and the landlord jacks your rent to the point you can't afford it, you can't walk with your feet because the number of affordable housing units for you to find is very, very limited. Middle-class people, if the landlord gets out of control, you got a ton of property in Montgomery County where you can go to another building and another landlord and pick a place where you can afford to live. Landlords know that tenants don't have the option of walking because they don't have a place they can walk to. And that's one of the things that has tied up some of the communities in Montgomery County. I'm very happy with the rent stabilization that we did. I'm not happy with the rate. I wish it was a little bit lower, and I wish we didn't have 23 years where properties don't come under rent stabilization. It is a way to stabilize communities. It gives people the opportunity to stay there. It helps build a stronger community, and people have plenty of opportunities to make profit. The law in Tacoma Park, which is kind of a model, allows landlords to get money for repairs they need to make above and beyond the minimums that are set by rent stabilization. So this idea that you're stuck with the 6% increase is just not true. We've already approved projects for more than 6%. Tacoma Park at times actually approved projects with over 15% increases because the repairs that are being done by the landlord were warranted that level of increases. And I was okay with that because you can't get blood from a turnip or a rock. And so you can't expect a landlord to do something that's economically impossible to do. It may be harder for the tenants, but reality is reality. And despite what I think about things, I have to deal with reality. I have to work inside that box. So I'm hoping that we can continue to do the work we're doing. Affordable housing, I think, is, to me, one of the most important things the county does. I think you underestimate the benefit it brings to communities and what it brings to families. And I think because most of us as homeowners, and I guarantee that most folks in this room are homeowners, we don't have to think about where we're living next month or next year. And on the other hand, people who are in the lower income groups making less than $50,000 face that question every single year. And that is destabilizing. Any of you, I see people nodding their heads. If you've ever had to wonder, where am I going to go live? And how are my kids going to feel about moving to the third neighborhood in 3 years? They know how stressful it is. We're lucky. We don't. I've never been in that situation in my life. And I think, it's important to acknowledge what else we need to do. We've got a lot of work to do in the county. Hopefully we'll get the resources to do the work we need to do. We've got a lot of smart people here. I know we have a lot of well-intentioned people here. And I hope that we can continue to make progress and make better progress than we've made so far. I'm happy in the direction we're going. There is a way to go. We wouldn't be having this, as Barbara talked about, people thought we were going to do something and this would be done with. I once read an article saying that housing isn't peanut butter. You can't treat it like a commodity on a shelf. You have to treat it like something different. And we need to keep that in mind, and we need to make sure we're doing our part to make sure people get taken care of and that people come first. Thank you.